Hello and welcome to Noah's Snark, the show where, when pressed for time, I mine material from the past to pass it off as new content, although this is not something I've discussed on my show before, that being how dumb Christian apologetic books can be. Case in point, J. Warner Wallace's instant classic, Snark Detected, God's Crime Scene. Let's get down to it. Christian apologetics is hardly anything new in Western literature, but the genre's work by the now disgraced author who was exposed as an outright liar, thanks largely to YouTubers Michael Beverly, Prophet of Zod, and Sergeant Skeptic, J. Warner Wallace tried to take a novel approach in making a case for the existence of the Christian God. Wallace, a former LA County detective, and according to him, a former atheist, claims to apply his years of experience in law enforcement examining evidence to conclude that the universe must have had a divine creator. Honestly, when I read that description, it intrigued me so much. That was good marketing. Anyway, God's Crime Scene, published in 2015, joined an ever-growing number of books that attempts to use a scientific or philosophical atheist's favorite tool, that being evidence and reason, against said atheist. Unfortunately for Wallace, that tactic has never truly worked for apologists against anyone with a brain, and it doesn't work now. Now, in making his case for the existence of God in his book, Wallace attempts to use a number of analogies, which, judging by the number of salivating reviews, seem to be quite engaging and convincing. This is as one would expect from other theists who are not versed in questioning whether an analogy is appropriate, much less question the conclusions the author draws, because they already believe this stuff. For example, Wallace begins the book by describing a possible suicide inside of a house and looking for clues that might give him reason to think that what actually took place was a murder. To do this, Wallace is going to look for things that may not be native to the scene, such as mud on the floor or a stranger's fingerprints or DNA. In other words, if the suicidal person was all alone, can Wallace account for things in the room as only being from inside the room? And right there, at the very beginning, just like the book of Genesis, Wallace basically shits the bed. One might be inclined to ask if a house is like the universe, and the answer would be no, because we have knowledge of things that can be outside of a house and brought in, but we have no knowledge of things outside of the universe that can be brought into the universe, seeing how we've never seen something inside the universe outside of the universe. Also, for a detective, might Wallace just as likely initially assume the mud came from the victim's own shoes, or that a stranger's fingerprints or DNA are not really from a stranger but from somebody the victim knew? There's a lot of nuance to being a detective Wallace leaves out, presumably because he knows his audience is stupid. So, to begin a book with such a flawed analogy does not help Wallace establish any credibility among even a passing skeptic. Any credibility or benefit of the doubt one might have given Wallace for being a detective evaporates so quickly he's the human equivalent of a drop of water on the hood of a black car in Arizona's midday sun. Is that an appropriate analogy? By the way, defending or accepting Wallace's argument on the account of his credentials is the argument from authority logical fallacy. After his house analogy prelude, Wallace glides into his first chapter, attempting to determine if the universe had a beginning. This appears to be a very important point to apologists, since given an infinitely old universe, an infinite number of possibilities might take place, such as the emergence of life. So theists must posit a beginning to the universe to make their theology of a sovereign God work. Thus, if the universe had a beginning, something must have set it in motion. And interestingly, monotheists think if the evidence indicates the universe has a design, it must have had a single designer, but never say why. Maybe because they know this would reveal their presuppositional beliefs. They also can't explain why they make this leap, given that you never see complex structures like a city built by a single person. But whatever. So, in order to argue against the infinitely old universe, Wallace likens a cause and effect universe to an infinite number of handguns in his police armory. If Wallace removes every fourth gun, he says, he is removing an infinite number from an infinite number, and that is clearly nonsensical. The author then concludes that you cannot do the same thing with cause and effect, so clearly the universe cannot be infinitely old. Problem is, infinite and abstract causes and effects are nothing like an infinite number of material objects, Wallace. Nor is it hard to imagine how an infinite number of causes and effects are possible if one considers God's supposedly infinite nature. If God causes things but is also eternal, how does that work for God but not for the universe? Another bad analogy from which Wallace derives one of his many hasty conclusions. Now, because it's an important point to apologists, Wallace perhaps feels, rightly so, that this argument isn't enough to convince a skeptic and continues to argue for a universe with a beginning. So, using science to lend his argument validity, he asserts that cosmologists and physicists largely agree that the universe began with the Big Bang. No, the universe as we understand it seems to have begun with the Big Bang, but we don't know the state of the universe beforehand. In still trying to defeat an infinite regress, Wallace argues that we can never arrive at the finish line of what is today without there being a beginning from which to start from. But what is today? Is it right now? But now has already come and gone, which makes one wonder just how long is now. Like the universe's origin, Wallace doesn't give any thought here to the slippery concept of time, which most physicists agree is a lot more tenuous than theories of the origin of the universe. Trying to sound smart, Wallace even weaves in a bit about the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the state of entropy of the entire universe as an isolated system will always increase over time and ultimately lead to the heat death of the universe, which can't be possible if the universe didn't start with the Big Bang. Except that, 1, it's not entirely certain that the universe is a closed system, and 2, assumes something like the Big Bang doesn't happen cyclically. Of course, anyone who knows anything about science knows that science is not 100% certain, which makes it curious that any apologist would lean on science to argue for the existence of God. Or maybe it's not so curious, as theists are finding out that appealing to blind faith is not enough to withstand the criticisms of said faith. Throughout the book, Wallace continues to make bad analogy after bad analogy from which he continually derives conclusions long since discredited by scientists and philosophers. I guess detectives don't have training in the realm of analogies. Honestly, I don't know why apologists are still using stuff like the fine-tuning argument other than out of willful ignorance or sheer stupidity. Wallace trots out many of the same old tired apologetic arguments like a belief in objective moral standards coming from outside the universe, which no evidence points to, and probably of which no one else would have probably ever thought of if not for Plato's idea of forms, an idea which monotheists borrowed heavily from in forming their mythologies. At best, all of Wallace's cosmological or ontological arguments would result in there being multiple entities in the construction of the universe, or to use Wallace's own suicide in the house analogy, suspects, in his possible murder scenario. On a side note, I have to ask, why are people in general so bad at analogies? In case you're wondering, good analogies explain complex ideas using familiar concepts, like this one. Explaining a joke is like dissecting a frog. You understand it better, but the frog dies. Or they show relationships such as fire is to heat as ice is to cold, which highlights how things work or have similar qualities. They make intellectual concepts accessible, like comparing a teacher to a captain or a difficult task to finding a needle in a haystack. But I digress. Reviews for God's crime scene are relatively glowing, which is understandable because he's mostly marketing to people already convinced of his conclusions who are ripe for grifting. On a positive note, the prose is written with a clear, easy to understand voice that unfortunately oversimplifies things, which should be alarming for someone who was a detective, which is me wondering how many innocent people went to jail based on this guy's faulty conclusions. The book does include some sidebars that describe the methods by which detective work is conducted, which I'm not sure Wallace has read, which are far more interesting than Wallace's theological conclusions. As Wallace himself concedes, he is a former detective and not a lawyer, with a lawyer being someone who would destroy Wallace's theological conclusions in an actual trial on the matter. I wound up giving the book 2 stars out of 5 for a gallant and unique effort to address laymen in a field crowded with theological shenanigans. Though these days I give it 1 star for clearly being a grift, the 1 star for trying to take a new perspective. Wallace's prose is clearly written for the layperson, but so much so that his arguments don't stand up to the most rudimentary scrutiny. I wish Wallace better luck with his future book, Cold Case Islam. Cold Case Islam should have been Wallace's follow-up to his first book, Cold Case Christianity, in which the author's investigative skills led him to believe that everything the Bible said about Jesus is true. Given that there is more evidence for the life of the Prophet Muhammad, it would be curious to see what conclusions Wallace would have made about the Muslim prophet and the claims made in the Qu'ran. And that's all I've got for you today. If you enjoyed today's episode and this kind of content, please consider hitting that like button and subscribe. I'm Atheist Josephina, aka AJV for Noah's Snark. Until next time, let the evidence guide you and wonder inspire you.